Chapter 23:43. The good fortune spirit seems to have been slain. Why aren't the virtuous virtues retreating yet? In the myriad of worlds, all the spectators couldn't help but have such questions in their hearts. Unfortunately, the virtuous virtues were so powerful that even Dan Yi and Huan Tong, soul-tempering cultivators, couldn't understand what was going on. They could only make wild guesses and conclude that the battle wasn't over yet. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to see what was going on. The cultivators of the various sects and clans couldn't be sure of the outcome of the battle, but they were able to learn many things from it. You could say that all of the sects and clans had gained something from the battle. Their horizons had been broadened, and many of the barriers in their Tao hearts had been removed. Although the great Taos and magic were vastly different from theirs, they were still able to see what Dan Yi was able to observe. If someone reached the peak of cultivation in the mortal world, they might be able to gain enlightenment about the mysteries of the Taos and Taos. However, in the following battles, Zhang Yan had used the Tao of strength to suppress the good fortune spirit. His profound Taoist magic was full of transformations that the lower-level cultivators couldn't comprehend. However, the Tao of strength was straightforward and abandoned all transformations. Everyone could see it clearly. Just now, many cultivators realized that the Tao of strength was not the least bit weaker than the Tao of qi. In fact, it was superior in some areas. Just by relying on the Tao alone, it was possible to cultivate to a very high level. Because of that, many cultivators decided to walk the path of the Tao of strength. However, the higher-level Taoist cultivators were more insightful and had more considerations. It could be seen that most of the virtuous virtues controlled the Tao of qi, and only one of them used the Tao of strength. From that, it could be seen how difficult it was to cultivate. Furthermore, if one's own technique could be cultivated to a high level, then what need was there to seek out an incomplete Tao of strength? Because of that, many rogue cultivators and smaller sects and clans began to search for the Tao of strength. As a result, the greater sects and clans did their best to advance the Tao of strength. As for the larger sects and clans, they maintained their original structure and cultivation methods, and didn't take the initiative to change anything. As for the Shaoqing sect of the Mountain and Sea Realm, their focus was different from the other sections. Their focus was not on the outcome of the battle, but rather on their patriarch's brilliant use of sword techniques. Ancestral Master Hongba's previous few sword strikes were the evolution of Tao arts, and their level was too high. Even deity refinement cultivators who had never grasped Tao arts were unable to understand it, so it was naturally impossible for them to understand the changes. However, what they were seeing now was what Zhang Yan was seeing. They had gotten a bargain here, so even if they didn't understand it now, they could try to imprint it in their consciousness and look at it again in the future. However, they quickly noticed that the things they'd memorized were actually ceaselessly being forgotten, and in this way, they would probably only be able to retain the purest bits in the end. But even this little bit contained endless truths, reaching the upper limit of their own understanding. In order to preserve these profound truths as much as possible, all the cultivators of the upper echelons did their best to memorize them, and then combined their strength to refine a magic treasure to carry them. It could be said that thanks to the personal guidance of the Shaoqing patriarch Hongba, the cultivators of the Shaoqing sect had gained far more than the cultivators of the other sections. Given time, they might be able to change the situation in which they had been lacking disciples for so long. Zhang Yan circulated his magic for a long time, and finally finished the evolution of the first nascent power that he had derived from his own Tao art. With a thought, he summoned that power, and as if he had knocked open a door, his consciousness was pushed to an unfathomably high place. Here, even without entering the river of the Great Path, he could still see the law power of the spirit of creation. At that moment, countless law power evolved in his eyes. Then, he stretched out his hand and tapped on the law power circulation with one finger. Every virtuous virtue had their own fundamental Tao art. However, the Tao art he used this time was not their own fundamental Tao art, but rather an evolution of it. It was the side of the great Tao that was in chaos. If there was anyone who had the deepest understanding of this Tao, it would undoubtedly be Fengdu. After Fengdu handed over his own Tao art, he understood the many changes in it. Otherwise, he would not have been able to turn his Tao art into chess pieces and place them on the chessboard of the great Tao. However, it was different from the Tao art of the spirit of good fortune using Ing Kong, Xiang Ming, and the others. It was only the most superficial use, which was why it could be cut off by Patriarch Hongba's sword. Not only did he turn this Tao art into his own, but he also pushed this Tao art to a higher level, which was far beyond Fengdu's reach. No matter how the limitless deification changed, it naturally had its own rules, and its rules relied on the great Tao. If you wanted to compete with it within the rules it had set, then it could deal with it calmly, making you run for your life. Fortunately, with his own Weili and Bu Shutian, his power had already surpassed the suppressed spirit of good fortune. In terms of the use of Tao art, there was no difference. However, if he attacked the formation that the opponent had already set, it would undoubtedly be an unwise move. Instead, it would be easier to disrupt the evolution. One must know that order and chaos had always been interdependent. The order itself was gradually moving towards chaos, and without chaos, there was no need for order. From this point of view, he did not need to change anything. He only needed to give the order a push, and it would be good enough for the order to enter chaos in advance. This was actually considered to be along the way. Even if the spirit of good fortune knew about it, he would not be able to stop it. If he wanted to rebuild the order and make the chaos return to order, it would require more effort than maintaining the order. After he cast the Tao art, he retracted his sleeves. With a turn of his mind, his consciousness had already returned to where it was originally. Ancestor Hongba and Ancestor Yao Han had been paying attention to the changes in all things. Just now, they felt as if something had broken in the great Tao. At the same time, the spirit of good fortune that they had eliminated seemed to reappear in their senses. However, this feeling only lasted for a moment, and all things returned to their original state. Ancestor Yao Han saw that Zhang Yan had returned to his senses and asked, "Fellow Taoist, is the Tao art proceeding smoothly?" Zhang Yan said, "I have already added another Tao art on top of the spirit of good fortune's Tao art. However, I still need to wait for it to evolve. If the spirit of good fortune does not choose to remove this Tao art, then it will be impossible to do this again." If the spirit of good fortune's Tao art was called limitless Tao art, then his Tao art could be called incomplete heavenly origin. If one fell into this Tao art, victory could also be considered defeat, and defeat could also be considered victory. Victory and defeat could be reversed at any time. There was no clear boundary, and everything was chaos. There were no rules or reason to speak of. And because this was an evolution based on the spirit of good fortune's Tao art, the person's Tao art could be considered the resources of this Tao art. If the person's Tao art existed, then the Tao art existed. If the person's Tao art was lost, then the Tao art was lost. After Ancestor Yao Han and Ancestor Hongho listened to his detailed description, they became more cautious. This Tao art would also trap them in this Tao art. There was no distinction between friend and foe. However, just like how limitless Tao art was a spirit of good fortune's Tao art, its final evolution would definitely be beneficial to the person. Therefore, Zhang Yan's incomplete heavenly origin was also beneficial to the virtuous ones. Victory and defeat aside, he absorbed all the Tao arts and power into his own Tao art. This was equivalent to using the power of both sides to evolve the Tao art for himself. This would definitely push him to greater heights. Even if he couldn't reach the end, he would get closer and closer to the great Tao. The two founding ancestors quickly noticed that along with the circulation of this technique, all the principles and rules they possessed in the past started to become chaotic under this change, and they practically couldn't look at it with their original gazes. And this was only the beginning. As the Tao art changed, everything would become more and more chaotic until everything was mixed up. However, they could also see that Zhang Yan didn't allow Bu Shutian to fall into this chaos. Instead, he deliberately delayed it. Although nothing could escape this Tao art once it changed for a long time, it wasn't difficult for them to see that when the time came, the spirit of good fortune would have no chance of turning the tables. Therefore, the person would definitely act before that happened. Zhang Yan silently sensed the operation of the Tao art and thought to himself, "I wonder what the person will choose?" Right at the same time that he circulated his Tao art, A certain spirit of creation that was in the opposing cause and effect suddenly noticed that something was wrong, and it came to a realization from this. It similarly pushed itself to a higher place, and then it understood everything. He realized that in such chaos, the battle of karma between opposing sides began to become disorderly and unpredictable. Perhaps one side was winning a moment ago, but in the next moment, it would become the losing side. You would never know what the final outcome would be, and there would be no outcome. When Ancestor Yao Han and Ancestor Hong Ho observed, they thought that this chaos would continue, but the spirit of good fortune had a higher cultivation and could see that when the Tao art evolved to the extreme, a proper order would appear. However, at that time, the proper order would be the proper order of the great virtue. All the rules would be set by the great virtue and would not be easily changed. Now, to deal with this Tao art, one was to destroy it from its roots. Because Zhang Yan's Tao art was based on the spirit of good fortune, as long as he withdrew the Tao art, all the changes would naturally be interrupted. But it wasn't easy to do so, because there was not only his Tao art here, but also Zhang Yan's Tao art. It was equivalent to putting the power of both sides in one place. If he forced it, not only would he not gain anything, but he would also suffer more losses. The other method was to carry out some kind of Tao art transformation on top of the two. However, if he did so, the Tao art of both sides would continue to extend and transform on top of it. As the power overlapped, it would be harder to destroy. After a few transformations, it would be difficult for both sides to break free from this kind of battle. At that time, neither side would have enough power to overturn it. If it was a spirit of creation that did not possess any humanity, perhaps it would choose the former without any hesitation. But at this moment, there was an additional variable in the secrets of the heavens. It changed its Tao technique and made another choice. Chapter 2344. Zhang Yan didn't have to wait for long before he felt a slight change in everything. Without a doubt, the spirit of creation had made a move. Moreover, it had chosen to fight for victory through the changes in the Tao technique. He didn't just sit back and watch. With a change of heart, his consciousness suddenly went to a higher place, and he quickly saw the changes in this Tao technique. However, he felt that there was still something strange here. After observing for a while, he realized that the spirit of creation didn't just use one move this time, but used two Tao techniques in succession. One of them was to change the order of the Tao laws between order and disorder. For example, there was order within the rotation of the sun and moon, and then there was disorder. Of course, the real situation was much more complicated. Sometimes, disorder and order changed every few days, and sometimes, it changed every minute, but they all followed a certain principle. Therefore, from a higher level, this was also a kind of order, but it could also be considered a kind of disorder. This Tao technique blurred the absolute boundary between the two, and it confused the fundamental nature of the Tao technique they had before. On the other hand, the other Tao art placed a lock on the numerous laws here, and it increased the burden on them, causing all the Tao arts to become sluggish and heavy, causing everything to slow down. If it wasn't changed, then the chaos in the end wouldn't arrive. In other words, even though the Tao arts he'd placed earlier hadn't been destroyed, they'd been guided away from their original path. He pondered for a while. Although the spirit of creation used two Tao techniques in succession, one Tao technique or two Tao techniques actually didn't have much meaning. As long as he made another move, and it was still useful, then he would include it in his Tao technique. This was just like adding another cover on top of the original Tao art. Whoever was the last to add the cover would be the owner. Even if the Tao art inside belonged to someone else, it would still be useless. However, the premise was that your Tao art could really cover all of them. Therefore, at this moment he only needed to circulate a Tao technique on it. However, it was best to follow the changes in the Tao technique before. This way, he could make use of the original power to the greatest extent, and he didn't need to spend too much effort. He pondered for a moment and gained some understanding. However, the crux of the matter was how to perfectly carry out the circulation of his Tao art. That was something that required some thought. After concentrating and deducing for a while, he had already straightened out the various joints within it. After that, he flicked his sleeve and transferred his Tao art into these rules. He looked at the circulation of the Tao technique and thought to himself, since I've walked on the path of the Tao technique, no one will be able to turn back unless something too big happens. In the contest here, due to the fact that there were fewer obstructions at the beginning, both parties were able to move freely. But as the overlapping of the Tao gradually increased, the situation would become more and more complicated sooner or later, and the path would become narrower and narrower. In the end, one wouldn't even be able to move easily. So, this place tested both parties' mastery of the Tao and their comprehension of the great Tao. It was to see who could last until the end. As soon as this thought crossed his mind, he retracted his force and allowed his consciousness to return to his conjured body. The two ancestors, Hongho and Yaowen, stood silently at the side as he circulated his Tao. The battle between Zhang Yan and the spirit of creation involved the circulation of the Tao at a very high level. Without reaching that level, one wouldn't be able to clearly see the methods used by the enemy, and thus, it would be difficult for them to interfere. However, this didn't mean that they could only watch from the sidelines. Because Zhang Yan was a great virtue, so were they. There wasn't an absolute difference between them. As long as they paid attention to the battle, they would be able to see the various uses of the Tao. Perhaps because of his own Tao art, what Hongho saw here couldn't be compared to what he gained from fighting others, but that wasn't the case for founding Master Yaowen. He saw many mysteries of the great Tao, and it wasn't hard for him to distinguish the methods used by Zhang Yan and the spirit of creation. It was just that he was limited by his whaley body and couldn't use them. As the two of them fought, he understood many principles, and his Tao rose layer by layer until it reached a certain limit. Just now it stopped. When Zhang Yan's consciousness returned, he also noticed the changes in his body. He smiled and said, "Congratulations, fellow Taoist." Founding Master Yaowen bowed and said, "I still have to thank fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Why thank me when fellow Taoist comprehended the Tao on his own?" Yao Han said, "Even so, if it wasn't for fellow Taoist, I'm afraid I would still be struggling for victory. How would I have the chance to comprehend the Tao calmly?" At this moment, founding Master Hongho said, "This is worth congratulating. When we fight against the spirit of creation, if we advance, he will retreat." Zhang Yan agreed. If the two ancestors were able to continuously improve their Tao arts during the battle, they only needed to reach the same level as him. Then, with the three of them joining forces, they would really be able to easily defeat the spirit of creation and win this battle. Unfortunately, the comprehension of Tao art wasn't that simple. To be able to improve through observation was already a rare opportunity, and the secrets of heaven wouldn't always be biased towards them. It was just that when founding Master Hongho was comprehending Tao art, they soon discovered that they were enveloped by the spirit of creation's Tao art. Therefore, he had a feeling that founding Master Yaowen's Tao art had improved, and it might be a sign that something was about to happen. Because of the improvement of Tao art, founding Master Yaowen's senses were different from what they saw just now. Just now, everything was blurry, but now, he could clearly see the changes between the Tao arts. He closed his eyes and observed for a moment before saying, "Fellow Taoist, the Tao art you are using now seems to be connecting layers of Tao art." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Fellow Taoist, you can see it clearly." Founding Master Yaowen sighed and said, "This Tao art can be said to be exquisite." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "No matter what kind of Tao technique it is, there will always be a flaw. Moreover, it's only temporary when I'm fighting against the spirit of creation. That person will definitely be able to find this flaw. Let's see what kind of technique he uses to defeat me." His Tao art could be called the same light of fate, and it could use a small force to pry open the great whaley and shake the foundation of Tao art from the bottom up. For example, under this Tao art, the fall of an ordinary tree could cause the heavens to collapse and the earth to cave in. Or a careless kick of a pebble could cause the heavens to shake. The harder you worked, the deeper you would sink. Of course, this was just an example. Bushutian was an important help, so he wouldn't let too much chaos happen here. Moreover, the price of shaking Bushutian's laws was not small, so he naturally wouldn't waste his energy. Just as the three of them were talking, Zhang Yan suddenly felt the qi of creation in his sleeve move. Sensing it, he turned his consciousness and entered an inexplicable place. Then he looked up and saw the shadow of a Taoist standing there. The Taoist's aura was faint and indistinct, and it was hard to tell whether it was real or fake. From the aura, he could already tell who the other person was. Just as he was about to greet him, a strand of consciousness came and the figure disappeared. At the same time, Hong Ho and Yaoan also felt this strand of consciousness. The two were surprised, clearly not expecting this person to try to send a message to them at this moment. Zhang Yan waited for the strand of consciousness to finish looking at it, and he couldn't help but think. That wisp of divine will told him one thing. The goal of the spirit of creation was to devour the great virtue to complete itself, but on the other hand, it was the same for the great virtue. It was just that the spirit of creation hadn't released all of its power yet. A large portion of its power was still being suppressed. So, if it was defeated just like that, although its path would return to the great Tao, it had to be known that this path was brought out from the essence of creation. If it returned just like that, it wouldn't be so easy to find. It could be said that the path of seeking the great path would not allow you to find a loophole like this. You would get how much you paid. If you fought with the spirit of creation that only had part of its power, then you would only get part of the result. If you truly wanted to grasp the great path, then you would undoubtedly need to take down the spirit of creation that had full power. However, to completely free the spirit of creation, you would need to devour all the great virtue Weili. This was undoubtedly referring to Ancestor Hong Ho and Ancestor Yaoan. When Ancestor Hong Ho and Ancestor Yaoan saw this strand of consciousness, they understood what this person meant. If they wanted to obtain the true great path, then they would need to voluntarily be devoured by the spirit of creation. However, this only provided them with a choice, and it did not necessarily have to be that way. The real choice was still in their hands. The two communicated with their consciousnesses. Now that they were competing with their Tao arts, it was hard to say who would win and who would lose in the end. This meant that both sides would take turns to shoulder the burden, and the weight would continue to increase until one side could no longer hold on and collapsed. This was completely up to the strand of fate. However, if they were to fight head-on again, it would be the most direct clash of strength. The strong would be the strong, the weak would be the weak. Zhang Yan wielded the Tao of strength, which was where his strength lay. Furthermore, he had Bu Su Tian as his support. Even if the spirit of creation released all of its power, he might still be able to put up a fight. At this point, the two had already made their decision. Ancestor Yaoan was the first to speak. Fellow Taoist Shenyuan, just now, I believe you have seen the consciousness? If I am not mistaken, it must have been imparted by fellow Taoist Tai Ming. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Every great virtue's qi and divine will were different, and it was difficult for others to forge it, unless it was devoured by the spirit of creation. But the problem was that if Ancestor Tai Ming was devoured, then there would be no one to control the creation qi, and the other great virtue Weili would be useless. The spirit of creation would be freed a long time ago, and there would be no need for them to compete with each other in Tao arts. They could just come at him head-on, so he was certain that just now was indeed Ancestor Tai Ming's consciousness, and not an imitation of the spirit of creation. Ancestor Hongba's voice was forceful. Since fellow Taoist Tai Ming said so, then he must have said that even if the spirit of creation was at its peak, fellow Taoist would still be able to fight him. Otherwise, he would not have said so. Ancestor Yaoan smiled. That's right. Although fellow Taoist Tai Ming did not say anything, if fellow Taoist Tai Ming did not have the power to do so, he did not need to impart his will to us. What are your thoughts on this? Please remember this book's domain name. 9 Heavens Shenhuang Mobile Version Website. Chapter 2345. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment. There were many things contained within the divine decree transmitted by the great underworld founding ancestor. Some of them weren't clearly stated, but if one were to look into them carefully, one would be able to notice that there were actually other profundities hidden deep within them. For example, the creation spirit had devoured the virtuous Weili. He originally thought that once the creation spirit succeeded, he would immediately be able to break through the siege of the creation qi. However, according to the great underworld founding master's explanation, that was not the case. There was a difference between being devoured actively and being devoured passively. Now, the creation spirit only lacked the Weili of the two founding masters, Hongho and Yao Han. However, even if the two were devoured, they would not be able to escape immediately. They still needed to be refined. In reality, this was the creation spirit and the great underworld founding master fighting for the authority to control the creation chi. If the creation spirit won, it was very likely that he would be able to take all the creation chi. If the two founding masters took the initiative to side with the great underworld founding master, then the great underworld founding master would have a higher chance of winning. In that case, he would be able to take all the creation chi. As for why the great underworld founding ancestor hadn't told the other virtuous Daos about this earlier, it was because all of this was established on the premise that Zhang Yan could fight the spirit of creation which possessed full strength. If that wasn't the case, then being able to defeat the spirit of creation which lacked strength and drive it into eternal silence was already the best outcome. In truth, he knew that even though the two ancestral masters had asked him what choice he should make, the two of them had probably already made their decision. It wasn't just the two of them, it was also the will of the great underworld ancestral master and the great benefactors. He looked up at the two and said, "If you ask me," he paused for a moment, then his expression became solemn and he said seriously, "I should seek the Tao." Founding Master Hongho laughed. "Fellow Taoist seeks the Tao, and so do I. For the sake of seeking the Tao, why should I cherish my life?" Founding Master Yao Han also said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist Hongho is right. According to fellow Taoist Tai Ming, if I am devoured by the creation spirit, this is also the path to the Tao. If fellow Taoist can win this battle, then we might not be at the end of the Tao." Zhang Yan nodded. From the great underworld founding master's divine will, he understood what he meant. After the two founding masters were devoured, their Daos and Weili would fuse together. When the creation spirit obtained the Weili, the two founding masters would also obtain the Weili and Tao. However, if they could not be freed, then it would be meaningless. But if they were freed, they would be much. But if they were to be freed, then it would be much more than the Tao and Tao. However, all of this was based on the result of his victory. If he were to lose in the end and the Tao was defeated, then everything would be over. If he could win this battle and gain control of the Tao, then all the Vedanta would have a chance to return from their solitude. However, this was not something that could be done in one go, especially if the creation spirit was prepared in advance. Otherwise, it would be hard to guarantee that nothing would go wrong. Therefore, the transformation of the Tao had to continue. Before that, it would be best to find an opportunity to change the Tao. That way, it would be even more secretive to activate it just now. Zhang Yan and the two founding masters conversed for a while and decided to wait for a suitable opportunity. Then he looked at the Tao. Ever since he used the technique of fate assimilating light, the foundation of the spirit of creation's Tao technique had been overturned by him. Although all the rules and regulations still existed, the weight had been reversed. A small force could often cause a great force to deviate. Because of this change, the various opposing battles were no longer decided by themselves. The changes in the heavenly secrets were magnified. It was not difficult for him to deduce that the creation spirit's next step was to restrain the rules. There was no other way. However, the specific changes would depend on the creation spirit's methods. The creation spirit did not make him wait for long. Soon, another Tao change came down and made some changes on the original rules. After Zhang Yan noticed it, he immediately looked up and looked carefully. When he finished looking, even as the opponent of the creation spirit, he could not help but nod. The creation spirit's change this time was much more ingenious. Perhaps it was to leave more leeway for its subsequent Tao arrangements. It did not make too many changes. Instead, it only chose one and abandoned the other. This method was actually to sort out the rules that should exist in the myriad of complicated changes and only use it on one opposing cause and effect. In other words, no matter how many changes there were in the outside world, it only needed to maintain this one change. I don't know about the rest, so it naturally has nothing to do with me. The cause and effect are outside, and I observe myself. This was also in line with the ingenuity of the combination of opposites. Especially when it focused on one place and condensed into one, it was very difficult to change the other rules. If it was not forcefully broken, then it could only make a fuss in the blank space that was given up. Zhang Yan pondered for a while. Although there were wins and losses in these countless opposing battles, as long as one won, then it would not truly lose. Therefore, he only needed to choose one. However, even though this method was brilliant, it had also forced him to retreat to the extreme, to the point where there was almost no way to retreat. If he tried to break through this point, it was possible for him to cut off all the subsequent changes, and it was not impossible for him to defeat him just like that. However, when he thought about it again, he found something wrong. He could see the flaw of the Tao method here, and the spirit of creation would not be unprepared. The key was that the person had not reached the point of exhaustion, and would not do such a desperate thing. Therefore, there was another change hidden behind this, and it was very likely to involve the fundamental Tao. Perhaps the person was waiting for him to crash into it. Thinking about this, he decided not to be entangled here, and instead he thought of another way. He looked at the Tao method a few more times. This method seemed to be unified, unbreakable, and it guarded the bottom line. However, under the Great Tao, there was nothing that could completely disregard external disturbances and remain unmoving. There was nothing that could do it, not the great virtues, and not even the spirit of creation. Even if the spirit of creation looked perfect and unchanging, after receiving the spirit bestowed by the great virtues, it had also undergone changes. As his thoughts turned to this point, he already had a few calculations in his heart. If he only relied on the rules and regulations, using the external changes to stir up the internal changes, it would be very difficult to change the Tao method, because the spirit of creation had left enough leeway for himself. There was a good comparison here. It was like a stubborn grain of sand that had sunk into the water. No matter how you shook the water and stirred up the waves, it would only sweep it around, but it was not easy to grind it into pieces. Fortunately, other than the rules and regulations of the Tao, he still had another thing that he could borrow. After calculating according to his own thoughts for a while, he smiled slightly, and with a wave of his sleeve, he sent another Tao method up. This method could be called impermanence of the universe, because the spirit of creation only maintained the outcome of a certain opposing cause and effect under a certain condition, and gave up on the countless other opposing causes and effects. Therefore, the rules and regulations that were given up were naturally changed by him. What he was doing now was to make these Tao method changes converge in one direction, but because of the existence of that thread of change in the heavenly secrets, the eternal opposing cause and effect did not exist. It was just that there were countless opposing causes and effects stirring up previously, so the heavenly secrets could fall into any one of them, and it would not interfere too much. And when there were only two opposing causes and effects left, and both were rigid and unchanging, that thread of heavenly secrets would definitely push for even more changes. Even though the spirit of creation only took one, and he took countless, because the changes were equivalent, the two were completely equal under the interference of the heavenly secrets. He had countless opposing causes and effects fighting here, so it was not a problem for many variables to appear, but once a variable appeared on the spirit of creation's side, the entire unbreakable rules and regulations might collapse, and even give rise to an outcome that was completely opposite of what it wanted. Ancestor Yao Han and Ancestor Hongho also saw the contest of Tao method changes between the two sides, and when they saw Zhang Yan make his move, the two were greatly impressed. If the spirit of creation's Tao method was said to be ingenious, using the simplest method to ensure that the rules would not be broken, and also to ensure that the Tao method would continue to belong to him, then Zhang Yan's method was also very ingenious, especially using the power of the variable of heavenly secrets to target his opponent. This had actually surpassed the scope of a simple contest of Tao methods. In truth, it was not difficult to think of all this. The key was how to arrange the Tao method and turn it into something tangible. If it were them, even if they were told that this could resist the spirit of creation's Tao method, they would not be able to do it due to the limitations of their own Tao method. Ancestor Yao Han pondered for a moment and discussed with Ancestor Hongho, then transmitted his divine will. Fellow Taoist, from what I can see, if the spirit of creation wants to break your Tao method, it will not be as easy as before. I think this is the best time for us to send the Weili to it. Zhang Yan made some calculations and agreed with ancestor Yao Han that the time was right, but it was hard to find an opportunity. Since he had made his decision, he did not hesitate and directed the divine will of the two ancestors in. At this moment, he was still high up and had not returned. When the two ancestors arrived, they once again saw the spirit of creation through his gaze. At this time, they only needed to go up and send the Whaley to it, and it would naturally be devoured. However, although the spirit of creation wouldn't resist this method, it could also cause variables to arise due to different people's judgments of the pros and cons. Thus, to ensure safety, they would follow the method the three of them had agreed upon and take the initiative to integrate the two wisps of creation chi into the mighty force. At that time, Ancestor Great Underworld would receive them and separate the entire creation chi from the spirit of creation. Ancestor Yao Han said, "According to fellow Taoist Great Underworld, there is only one Tao. Only one person can walk this Tao path first, and then others can climb this Tao together. If you want to achieve this, you must obtain all the Tao methods of the spirit of creation. I will leave this to you, fellow Taoist." As he spoke, he solemnly bowed. Ancestor Hong Ho also bowed and said, "In this battle, fellow Taoists' achievements will be our achievements. Fellow Taoists' sword will be our sword." Zhang Yan's expression also turned serious as he solemnly bowed and said, "Of course I will not let you down." Chapter 2346. After conversing with Zhang Yan, the two ancestors, Hong He and Yao Han, nodded to each other, then withdrew a wisp of creation chi into their sleeves. At this moment, it was precisely when Zhang Yan's Tao had occupied the order. The spirit of creation would definitely think of a way to change it later. When he made his move, it would be a suitable gap to take action. Zhang Yan was also waiting quietly. He had previously seen from the great underworld ancestral master's divine will that before he appeared, the Vedanta and the spirit of creation had maintained a stalemate, and the odds of victory were not high. Therefore, according to the great underworld ancestral master's original plan, if the Vedanta were to lose this battle, then he would turn himself into the last heavenly order and not allow the spirit of creation to complete the great Tao. He would continue to wait for the descendants of the human Tao to come out and find that trace of great Tao opportunity. Because of him, the virtuous virtues had a certain chance of winning, so the great underworld ancestral master had placed all his hopes on him. Just as the two ancestors, Yao Han and Hong He, had said, if he won this battle, then all the great virtues would have a chance to return to being. If not, then they would all enter silence. Amidst the silence, the laws of Tao that he had passed down began to change slightly. It was obvious that the spirit of creation had begun to move. At this moment, he felt something and turned his head to look. He saw a mysterious aura rising from the bodies of the two ancestors, Yao Han and Hong He. The two of them smiled at him and nodded. Then, their Dharma bodies faded away like smoke. He bowed to the place where the two of them had disappeared and then looked at the place where the spirit of creation was. With the departure of the two patriarchs, the fortune chi would appear very soon. The owner of this chi was very important. The great underworld ancestral master had to successfully extract this chi from the spirit of creation before he could proceed with the next step. Among the Vedanta, those who were truly devoured by the spirit of creation were Wei Ming, Ji Zhuang, Xiang Ju, and the others. However, their strength belonged to the weakest level. Although the chi of creation also contained the Weili, it was a negligible part. Apart from the great underworld patriarch, the five Weili, Lingyu, Xian Zhao, Yi Chong, Hong He, and Yao Han were just now the true support for controlling the creation chi. Even though the spirit of creation had swallowed Lingyu, Xian Zhao, and Yi Chong on the chessboard of the Grand Tao, it hadn't had the time to absorb and refine them, and it was precisely because of this that it was unable to utilize their Tao arts. If these few were devoured, the Weili that controlled the creation chi would lose most of its control, and the creation spirit would be freed. Although the great underworld ancestral master was the only one left, he wouldn't be able to unleash much power once all the other virtuous virtues were gone. Even if he could still hold on, he wouldn't be able to unleash much power. However, the reason they dared to act now was precisely because of this crucial point. Previously, When the Vedanta were surrounded by the tribulation power, their strength had improved greatly while fighting against the creation spirit. The great underworld patriarch didn't stop either. He used his fundamental Tao art to fuse his Weili with the creation chi. If Zhang Yan was the lord of heaven, then the great underworld patriarch was the lord of creation chi. However, the difference was that because he was compatible with the creation chi, as long as the chi underwent a transformation, the great underworld patriarch would walk to the void side of the grand Tao and wouldn't fall into the being side. According to the agreement, once the great underworld founding ancestor left the body of the creation spirit, then he would use the energy of creation to maintain the heavenly order. In other words, there would only be one order left in the world, and besides the fundamental Tao, no Tao art would be able to evolve within that order. This was necessary. After breaking free from the suppression of the chi of creation, the power of the spirit of creation would be completely released, and it would be able to undergo even more changes in the laws of creation. If they were to compete in this aspect, it would obviously be extremely disadvantageous to the side of the human Tao. After waiting for a short while, his heart stirred slightly and he looked up. At this time, he had already sensed the change in the aura of the spirit of creation. The spirit of creation's power seemed to be constantly releasing, and in the confrontation of mighty forces, he could feel that the power was expanding endlessly, even making him feel like he was being supported and floating. With a thought, a layer of dark light instantly enveloped his body, and he stood firmly like a pillar. It was also at this moment that the creation aura that was suppressing the creation spirit's body started to surface. This undoubtedly meant that the creation chi was no longer suppressing the creation spirit's power. A process from beginning to end had ended, but this was the beginning of another process. At this moment, the mysterious feeling that the creation chi gave him was extremely strong. It was as if he only needed a thought to guide this power out, and anything could be changed by it. It could even directly eliminate the creation spirit. However, the power of this chi ultimately had an upper limit. Just like how he couldn't suppress the creation spirit even after using all of Bu Shutian's power, no matter how the chi changed, it couldn't do it. The creation spirit, Bu Shutian, and the perfect creation chi were all born from the shattered creation spirit, and it could be said that they were on the same level. The only difference was that the creation spirit had its own consciousness, and it was where the god of the creation spirit resided. Just this alone caused the other two to be plundered without anyone controlling them, and they couldn't resist them. Not only that, but because the creation spirit had its own consciousness, it could also use the devouring of great virtue to increase its strength and complete its Tao. This was also why the creation chi could only suppress a portion of its power. The creation chi only appeared for a moment before disappearing again. Zhang Yan understood that the great underworld ancestor had re-established the rules of the Grand Tao according to the will of the divine will. Zhang Yan checked. Just now, the Tao of both sides didn't exist, but this didn't mean that there was no longer any rules. The rules were re-established by the great underworld ancestor, so it was imperceptibly biased towards the human Tao, which was extremely beneficial to him. In fact, this wasn't the first time the great underworld ancestor had done this. For example, the barrier of Zhou Huanyuan Jade was also set up by the great underworld ancestor while suppressing the creation spirit. Its purpose was to prevent the creation spirit from gaining power after it entered the world and suppress the human Tao inheritance. From this moment onwards, the Tao that he had manifested during the battle with the creation spirit was erased, and everything seemed to have returned to its original point. At this moment, countless rays of light spread out from the everything, covering every corner. Then, the creation spirit, shrouded in light, walked out of the void with an unprecedented momentum. Within Busksu heaven, there was an atmosphere of fear spreading among the worlds. Originally, under the envelopment of the spirit of creation's infinite Tao transformation, the spirit of creation was banished into eternal silence by Zhang Yan. Many people thought that the virtuous ones had already defeated this great enemy. In reality, the battle between the virtuous ones and the creation spirit had indeed come to an end. But with the collapse of the Tao, all of this was gone. When the cultivators saw the two virtuous virtues suddenly disappear and the spirit of creation reappeared, It was clear that the side of the virtuous virtues had lost in the battle just now. This was undoubtedly a huge blow to the hearts of the cultivators. Huan Tong saw the changes in the hearts of the cultivators and sighed. Taoist Dan Yi, the situation isn't right. You should withdraw your magic. Dan Yi thought about it, then shook his head and insisted. If the human Tao really lost, then it's also the will of the heavens. Living beings can't choose their own life and death, but they should at least know why they're going to die. Huan Tong sighed. Sometimes, not knowing about this saves us a lot of trouble. Dan Yi looked at the cultivators and said, things aren't that bad yet. Taoist Xinyuan hasn't lost yet. I personally feel that perhaps the disappearance of the two virtuous ones is also a move. Huan Tong said, I hope so. Dan Yi turned to look at him and said, even if the situation is really dire, the fate of the world is in the hands of Taoist Xinyuan. Perhaps he will push a fellow Taoist to help. If that's the case, it'll be very important for the people of the world to see this. Fortunately, it hasn't reached that stage yet. This means that Taoist Xinyuan still has some confidence in this battle. Huan Tong thought about it and nodded. What Zhang Yan said made sense. However, even if Zhang Yan could push them, or even those with outstanding talents, to the virtuous ones, he didn't think they could fight against the creation spirit. But that was all he could think for now. Zhang Yan looked at the creation spirit. Just by looking at it, he felt a heavy whaley pressure pressing down on him. With a wave of his sleeve, he shattered the pressure. But then, endless light shone down on him, and there seemed to be a huge hand pressing down on him. Faced with this familiar scene, his eyes flashed. He stepped on a divine sovereign and raised 2 fingers. As his sleeves fluttered, he pointed upwards. This was the most direct collision. Just like the first time he fought with the incarnation of the creation spirit, the 2 whaley collided fiercely. Amidst the rumbling, everything stopped. A door opened in front of him. For a moment, it was as if the Supreme Tao was right in front of him. He was about to watch, but with just a slight movement of his mind, it was like throwing a stone into a calm pond. Layers of ripples spread out, and everything in front of him shattered. Everything returned to its original state. He and the creation spirit stood on 2 sides, facing each other from afar. It was as if the collision just now didn't happen. He slowly took a breath, and his gaze sharpened. Now, the creation spirit was only left with its own fundamental Tao. Any changes in Tao could not be activated in the current rules. Now was the best time to kill it. When he was on the chessboard of the great Tao, he had used several chess pieces to accumulate a huge advantage. He forced the creation spirit to give up all its Tao and play the chessboard. But this chessboard had long entered the entire great Tao, and all the seeds had already landed in the All-You. It was just that the time wasn't right, so he hadn't activated it. But now, it was time to use this move. Please remember this book's domain name. Mobile version. Chapter 2347. Zhang Yan had heard ancestral master Ling Yu say that the so-called path of perfection was to be able to be far away and yet be close to others. He deeply agreed with this. No matter if it was the lofty Vedanta or the lowly and insignificant beings of the mortal world, they were all within the great Tao, and there was no difference in superiority. The spirit of creation was born to stand at a high place, so his gaze would also fall here. If there was no need, he would not have the slightest intention of looking down. However, he did not know that every single being in existence had its own meaning, nor did he know what kind of power all beings would radiate if they were guided. The spirit of creation that he was facing today was not just him alone, but the beings that stood behind him as well. If he obtained a name for the method he was preparing to activate, it could be called the spirit refinement of all beings. Among all beings, as long as they existed and stepped onto the path of the Tao, logically speaking, everyone could attain the Tao because of the existence of a trace of fate, and this was also permitted by the great Tao. However, under the great Tao's luck, this was only a trace of fate reserved for all beings. As long as all beings did not come to an end, then this possibility would exist, but perhaps one would never be able to wait for that day. However, if this could really be realized, then everyone could attain the Tao, everyone could become spirit refinement, and everyone could even become Vedanta. When this power was gathered, even the spirit of creation would not be able to stop it. Of course, it was impossible for him to accomplish this with his own strength, so he used the Great Tao chessboard and used the Great Tao's luck to push this matter forward. However, even if he accumulated sufficient chess power on the chessboard, it could only allow everyone's achievements to exist for an instant, and only this instant was real. Because this instant was actually a possibility that had been extracted from the many impossibilities, and it was between reality and illusion. After this, when the Great Tao's luck returned to the right path, everything would return to normal. Fortunately, he only needed this instant. As long as he could activate this power, it would be enough to defeat his opponent. For all beings, even though it was impossible for them to ascend to the heavens in a single step, this experience would allow them to obtain boundless sublimation. Those who were truly fated to obtain the method would definitely have a smooth path of cultivation in the future. Some of them were already on the path to a higher level. If they could grasp this opportunity, it would save them tens of thousands or even millions of years of hard cultivation. However, even if it was only for an instant, they would not be forcefully promoted. Everything still had to conform to the order of the heavens. Because everyone was different, everyone's path of Tao was different, and everyone's achievements were different. Thus, it was difficult for the power of all beings to gather in one place. Fortunately, he was the master of Busu Tian. How the world would change depended on him. As long as he controlled the general trend and smoothed all kinds of obstacles, all beings would be able to transcend in an instant. In the past, when living beings entered the path of Tao, there were three main obstacles on the path of Tao. The first was spiritual opportunity. Without it, it was difficult to cultivate. Moreover, when a cultivator cultivated to a profound state, if he wanted to break through a world and ascend to another world, the purple spiritual opportunity was also indispensable. In the past, if a Taoist wanted to transcend the world and achieve spirit refinement, he would have to rely on the land of creation. Originally, there were countless worlds that were born and destroyed in the world, but the worlds that were attached to the land of creation were only a small part. But now, these three obstacles had been resolved. Lastly, if a Taoist wanted to transcend the world and achieve spirit refinement, he must rely on the land of creation. Originally, there were countless worlds that were born and destroyed in the world, but the worlds that were attached to the land of creation were only a small part. But now, these three obstacles had already been resolved. The teaching method allowed one to abandon the land of creation for cultivation. Even if the land of creation was not flourishing, everyone could still enter the Tao. After the great underworld patriarch re-established the order of the Great Tao, the obstruction of the Yuan Jade was no longer a natural chasm for the Tao. Now that all worlds were contracted and the essence of creation was merged into one place, there would be no obstacles on the path of cultivation. This also meant that no matter which world a Taoist was in, the possibility of cultivating to the highest realm would be infinitely magnified. And after these conditions were met, the matter was not over yet. There was still one last step. After a Taoist transcended the world, there would be the power of the Great Tao chessboard behind them. Without creation Pauline, it would be impossible for one to achieve great virtue. Perhaps, one would be lost in the long river of Great Tao and never be able to return. And if one stopped at spirit refinement, then it would lose its meaning. Because if one did not achieve great virtue, it would be difficult to use the Tao. Even if there were many people like this, they would not be a threat to the creation spirit because of the difference in their levels. It only needed to operate the Tao of being and nothingness to turn everyone back into nothingness. Zhang Yan had thought of this long ago. Although he did not have creation Pauline, it should be known that creation Pauline's Tao was completely seized by him and turned into his power. Therefore, if he used his own power to replace this item, then he could push the heavenly fate that was extracted from all living beings to the great virtue realm. Among the many great virtues, there was actually only one person who could do this because this was his fundamental Tao. It was a Tao that existed after he achieved the grotto heaven. When they were playing on the great Tao chessboard, Grandmaster Ling Yu was the first to stand out and be devoured by the creation spirit because he saw that the killing move he had planned could indeed deal with the creation spirit. And the reason why the other great virtues were willing to cooperate and let him take charge of the situation was also because of this. Previously, when the creation spirit sensed that something was wrong, he immediately gave up all his Tao and retreated from the great Tao chessboard. That was undoubtedly the right choice. If he did not play on the great Tao chessboard, then Zhang Yan would use the power of the great Tao chessboard to continuously push living beings to the great virtue realm from the bottom. When one Tao chessboard was used, it would attract another person to come up and continue to place pieces. As long as the power of the great Tao did not stop, it would be endless. Just placing pieces with Tao chessboard alone would be enough to kill this fellow. And just as he was thinking about it, the creation spirit felt the same sense of danger as when he was on the great Tao chessboard. He did not know where it came from, but he knew that as long as the opponent in front of him was expelled, then this matter would be resolved. Therefore, he released the Weili, and it arrived with the light again. Zhang Yan grinned. Presently, all the variations of the Tao arts had been obstructed by the Grandmaster Great Darkness, so the spirit of creation could only utilize its mighty force to compete with him. However, this just happened to be the aspect that he wasn't afraid of the least. Even if the creation spirit's power had completely recovered, he still had the Weili in addition to his power. With the two combined, it would not be difficult for him to face this fellow head-on. Seeing the opponent's Weili pressing towards him, he did not hesitate and met it with another punch. The two's power continuously collided, but it seemed that they were evenly matched. If this continued, it seemed that there would never be a victor. He knew that the creation spirit might have sensed something, but at this point, this great enemy could no longer stop this matter. After another punch, the Divine Lord under his feet raised his head, and the black and white chi behind him fused with the five-colored light, turning into one yuan, and once again collided with the attacking Weili. Zhang Yan retreated slightly, raised his fingers like a sword, and waved his sleeves. The boundless Weili was supported by him, and at the same time, his expression became solemn. When he had formed his grotto heaven, he had written a spell and said, "May all fated people in the world be able to rely on this to enter the Tao." Later, when he formed his grotto heaven, to prove his ambition he even said, "Don't fall into reincarnation and enter the universe, pass on the Tao in the human world. I am willing to kill all tribulations with a single sword, and exchange the heartless for the sentient heavens." And today it was time for him to complete this oath. As he thought about it, his finger dropped down and heavily tapped somewhere. In an instant, a certain missing link in the circulation of the great Tao was instantly filled up, and the power that was originally accumulated there began to roll with an unstoppable momentum. In Busha Heaven, everyone's eyes were focused on this battle. Now, only the last Vedanta was left to fight against the creation spirit, and it could be said that he carried the hope of all living beings. At this moment, everyone felt a strange feeling appear in their minds. However, upon closer inspection, it seemed as if nothing had happened. Only some of the more profound individuals had comprehended it. Unknowingly, a great Tao had already opened up in front of them. And in a place that even they could not see, phantoms walked out from their bodies and walked out of the world. In the headquarters of the Yen sect, Gao Qingtu's emotions couldn't help but surge when he saw Zhang Yan and the spirit of creation ceaselessly clashing head-on. But suddenly, the Divine Will transmitted a mysterious thought to him. At this moment, he seemed to have understood something. He slowly stood up, looked at the jade tablet, and began to recite the Yen sect's Tao. As he spoke, the higher-ups of the Yen sect also felt something, stood up one after another, and began to recite the Yen sect's Tao. Within the world, wherever there was a disciple of the Yen sect, the sound of reciting began. Brilliant voices resounded in the heavens and the worlds, and then spread out. And from their bodies, that trace of possibility was constantly drawn out, and like a reflection, it was constantly thrown into the Tao of their own sect's patriarch. In the depths of Busha Heaven, Dan Yi and Huan Tong were originally watching the battle, but suddenly fell into a trance, and both of them felt a wave of power descend. It seemed to be pushing them to climb to a higher realm. The two of them couldn't help but reveal a look of surprise, but then another wave of divine will came, and they understood everything. But it was difficult for the two of them to determine whether this was the arrangement of the creation spirit. While they were hesitating, they suddenly felt something and looked towards Xian Yuantian. When they saw Zhang Yan's incarnation smiling and nodding at them, their suspicions were immediately dispelled. The two of them looked at each other, and then no longer resisted, allowing this force to push their bodies. With a loud bang, they found that they had already walked into the long river of the Great Tao. After entering this place, the two of them couldn't see each other, but they both felt that there was a force guiding them. As long as they willed it, they could return to everything, so they walked towards the end of the Great Tao with ease. What the spirit refinement saw was the truth. They were spirit refinement cultivators themselves, and had long since transcended the world. That trace of heaven's fate descended, it would definitely help them. Even if Huan Tong was promoted by Zhang Yan, but at this moment, with the help of the chessboard of the Great Tao, he could also achieve this result. Chapter 2348. After Dan Yi and Huan Tong entered the river of the Grand Tao, they quickly arrived at their limit. Before this Grand Tao, cultivators would unconsciously move towards the end. However, both of them were cautious people and didn't advance rashly out of greed. Instead, they stopped here and followed the guiding force to return to where they came from. In just an instant, the two of them broke through the gap between existence and nothingness, and they appeared once more in the silent void. However, right at this moment, they suddenly felt a force press down upon them, and it seemed as if it intended to strike them back into nothingness. The two of them were shocked and hurriedly used the Weili to resist it. However, the force was so formidable that it far exceeded the upper limits of what they could resist. Right when they felt that it was difficult to resist, another Weili came over and dispersed the force that pressed down upon them. Zhang Yan's figure appeared in front of the two of them, and he said via divine will, "The two of you can return to Busha Heaven for now." Even though Dan Yi and Huan Tong had truly cultivated to the great virtue realm and possessed a Tao art each, they knew their own limits. At this moment, their strengths were at most equivalent to Wei Ming, Ji Zhuang, and the others when they were in the Weili, and they were even far inferior to Taoist Fengdu. Even if the spirit of creation only possessed a portion of the Weili, it was still unable to resist it, let alone Taoist Fengdu. Since they were unable to be of much use in a battle of this level and might even distract Zhang Yan, the two of them didn't dare stay here any longer. After they bowed, they retreated to Busha Heaven along with Zhang Yan's power, and they waited for the final moment to exert their strength. As soon as Zhang Yan sent the two of them away, he smashed out a few punches in succession and collided with the spirit of creation once more. Ever since he just now circulated his Tao art, he sensed that the spirit of creation's attacks had suddenly become fiercer. Obviously, the spirit of creation had exerted its full strength. Moreover, he possessed the Tao art of strength and the Busha Heaven Weili, so he naturally wouldn't retreat because of this, and he didn't show any weakness as he faced the spirit of creation head-on. The circulation of the Great Path had also become somewhat sluggish during the battle between the two. He raised his eyebrows. It wasn't difficult to see that this was the spirit of good fortune's intention. It wanted to use the collision force between the two of them to delay or even disrupt the Tao art he was pushing forward. However, after all of this was activated, it had already fused into his fundamental Tao art. Unless his opponent was able to immediately drive him into eternal silence, otherwise, it would be impossible for him to stop. However, if that person could do that, then there would be no need to go against that Taoist art. He felt that the human side of the spirit of creation was constantly increasing. It was obvious that after it sensed danger, it couldn't find a solution in the current situation. Therefore, it could only continue to infuse itself with human nature in order to increase the changes in the heavenly secrets. He smiled faintly. Even if the spirit of creation truly transformed into a living being, it would only be itself. Moreover, he had the support of all living beings, so how could anyone resist him? Somewhere in the nameless void of Busu Heaven, there was a barren desert. There was not a single plant to be seen, nor was there any trace of life. There was only gravel everywhere. Shin Chong sat on the ground. His spirit sank into an unknown place and was deducing the method to ascend to the upper state. Although he had escaped from the prison world long ago and had even gone through a battle for the Yuanjue, he had not officially gone into closed-door training for long. Previously, he had been searching for purple pure spiritual vigor everywhere for his cultivation. As he was deducing, he suddenly felt an external force suddenly arrive. This force surpassed everything he had seen before. It passed through the endless void and even the flow of time. It directly landed on his body. Under the push of this force, his cultivation deduction became extremely smooth. Unknowingly, he had reached the end of the Tao that he could reach. He opened his eyes abruptly, but he felt that he did not use much of his magic power. Even his divine decree was not depleted much. However, he felt as if he had lived through millions of years in that mysterious place just now. Without a doubt, this must be caused by the force just now. Just as he was thinking about the origin of this, he sensed something and looked up to see a screen of light appearing out of thin air not far away. He didn't know when it had appeared, but with just a single glance, many things were reflected in his mind, and he immediately learned many things for no reason. He pondered for a while. If there was no accident, the force just now should be passed down by the great virtue of human Tao. This power did not directly give him a cultivation method or a cultivation base. Instead, it allowed him to complete a cultivation method that he should have spent millions of years to deduce in an instant. What he obtained here was still what he had comprehended on his own. In fact, he was confident that he didn't need this push. He could also reach this step by himself. However, he was also clear about the importance. After understanding the current situation, he understood that there was no way out of the battle between the great virtue and the spirit of creation. If the human Tao lost the battle, then the later generation would need to come forward and take over. And he was also involved in it. In the face of such a dangerous situation, what was a little personal preference? With a thought, the mysterious stone appeared out of thin air and hovered 3 feet in front of him. He had been competing with the Yuan Jade and didn't obey its will. But at some point, the Yuan Jade lost its wily restraint and completely became an object without a master. And now that the deduction of the road ahead was complete, there was no reason to delay anymore. He stretched out his hand, grabbed the mysterious stone, and activated the cultivation method that he had comprehended. His cultivation experience was extremely profound, and after a round of cultivation he successfully saw the sea of vital energy and planted his own qi activity within it. As a bright light shone out, his body turned into a limitless brilliance, and then it merged again. As it scattered, he had successfully entered the realm of true yang. After every true yang was achieved, there would be an avatar. If it wasn't dealt with in time, it could become a great hidden danger that could threaten oneself. He didn't kill it at the first moment but let it go. If the avatars thought that they could replace him, then they could find him. He was worried that he didn't have an opponent, so he welcomed them. If these avatars ran away in fear, then they weren't worth his attention. At this time, he looked at the screen of spiritual light again. He didn't believe that this scene was only transmitted to him. Many people could see it, and the goal of the Almighty being behind it was to let the people of the human Tao know that there was a great enemy like the good fortune spirit. Looking at the vast and violent scene reflected in the screen, he couldn't help but sigh. He hated that his cultivation wasn't high enough, and that he couldn't personally fight the good fortune spirit. And just as these thoughts ran through his mind, he looked up as if he had sensed something. In his days, it was as if another him had stepped out of the world and was walking toward the end of the great Tao. In the mountain and sea realm, the people of Qinsong School were sitting on the void sea, watching the scene of the battle on the screen of spiritual light. In addition to them, there were more than 10 mortal metamorphosis cultivators who had come to visit the Tao. Mengjide said in a low voice, "It seems that only one great virtue is left to fight the good fortune spirit." Although no one said it explicitly, he and the elders of Qinsong School could sense that the last great virtue was most likely Hall Master Duzhen. Sun Jiyan looked around and said, "So what if it's just one person? From what I can see, it's clearly a draw, and I dare to say that Hall Master Duzhen will be the final winner." When these words were spoken, the elders of Qinsong School didn't have any reaction, because Sun Jiyan had always been this daring. However, The mortal metamorphosis cultivators who had come to visit the Tao were all surprised and confused. One of the Taoists thought for a moment and asked, "Fellow Taoist son, why do you dare to say such a thing? Could it be that you saw something that we didn't?" Sun Jiyan laughed and said, "Could it be that you all didn't see it? Just now, when the two great virtues disappeared without a trace, our human Tao always had the upper hand, so why would they make such a choice? Therefore, from what I can see, the two of them must have done this intentionally and entrusted the final responsibility to the last great virtue." The Taoist wasn't convinced and frowned. "This is only fellow Taoist son's own deduction, but from what I can see, before the two great virtues disappeared, the good fortune spirit had already disappeared, but after it disappeared, it reappeared again. So why didn't the two great virtues fall into this person's trap?" Although the mortal metamorphosis cultivators on his side didn't say anything, they also felt that his words were fair. They couldn't understand the changes in the great Tao and didn't know what was going on, so they didn't dare to easily come to a conclusion. However, Sun Jiyan's words were completely looking at the good side, which couldn't convince them. Sun Jiyan raised his eyebrows. He also scoffed at the views of these people. He thought that rather than mourning, it was better to win. Why did the current situation have to be from the perspective of the destruction of the human Tao? Why didn't they think that the good fortune spirit was about to be killed by their Hall Master Duzhen? Just as everyone was talking, an inexplicable feeling appeared in the minds of everyone in the Qinsong school. The elders looked at each other and moved in unison. In the next moment, everyone arrived at the top of the floating heavenly palace. On the steps, Qin Mabai's sleeves fluttered, and he stood there with a horsetail whisk in his hand, looking at the boundless void as if he was watching something disappear into the distance. "Sect Master?" Sun Jiyan took a few steps forward and said happily, "Sect Master Senior Brother, you've come out of seclusion?" Qin Mabai turned around, and as his gaze fell, everyone present instantly felt as if they had become incomparably small, and their hearts couldn't help but tremble. Shen Baishuang cupped his fist and said, "Congratulations on your success, Sect Master Senior Brother." Sect Master Qin waved his horsetail whisk and said, "Now that Hall Master Duzhen is fighting with the good fortune spirit, my personal success is only a small matter compared to the safety of the human Tao." Mengjida said in a deep voice, "I wonder if Hall Master Duzhen can defeat the spirit of creation in this battle." Sect leader Qin said slowly, "Rather than making a rash decision based on your own heart, why don't you try to believe Junior Brother Sun's words?" Everyone fell into deep thought after hearing that. Sect leader Qin looked in the direction of the western desolate region. There was a faint sword chi in the sky. It was obvious that Yu Xianxiao had also seen the correct path of the Great Way because of the change in his Taoist law. He had comprehended its profoundness and succeeded in coming out of his closed-door cultivation. On the shocking sky mountain, Yu Xianxiao stood at the top of the mountain. Behind him were the cultivators of the Shaoqing sect. Ying Chuanxiu said, "Sect Master, it seems like the ancestral master is no longer here." Yu Xianxiao stared at the screen of light and said in a low voice, "The founding ancestor isn't here, but his sword intent is still there." Even though he was similarly unable to see through the changes in the upper levels of the Tao art, he was able to sense that the sharp sword insight still existed within everything, and it was suffused with an extraordinary fighting spirit. As long as the sword intent still existed, then no matter who wielded the sword, it would still fall in the end. Chapter 2349. After Zhang Yan activated the living being's spiritual enhancement art, many people who were stuck at the bottleneck of cultivation and had outstanding talent broke through the barrier one after another. And with every step they took, it increased the possibility of them attaining the Tao. Although the worlds had merged and there were no more similar worlds, for most living beings, their futures were always changing, and the present was filled with endless possibilities. This Tao was to take out the side of them that had the highest chance of attaining Tao and make it real through the great Tao. For those cultivators who had severed their past and future, before they understood all the changes in their bodies and understood all the mysteries of the great Tao, as long as their own path of cultivation also had the two qualities of possibility and impossibility, they would be included in it. As for the great figures of human path like Fu Qingming, Lu Lin, Qin Chan, and the others who had been returned, they also sensed this power when it came. Without external help, they would not have been able to reach the living being's spiritual enhancement art. However, forceful advancement was also a possibility. Therefore, they had also seen many profound truths of the Grand Tao through this fortuitous encounter. Even though they had quickly forgotten about these things, if they really had the chance to advance further, then these things would be recalled once again. Amidst all this, the battle between Zhang Yan and the creation spirit was still ongoing. Before the decisive strike intervened, their battle would continue like this. If it was a battle between Vedanta, the collision of their mighty powers would transmit their Tao techniques to each other. But now, because their powers had already interfered with the circulation of the great Tao, such a thing did not happen. However, there was another kind of change happening inadvertently. Zhang Yan had a feeling that the power of the spirit of creation was becoming stronger and stronger as he clashed with it. The same thing had happened when the Vedanta fought against the spirit of creation, so he was not surprised by this change. It was just that Bu Shutian's power had also increased due to the battle, and he had not fallen behind by a single step, so he did not feel it too clearly. He had thought that the increase would not be significant until Dan Yi and Huan Tong became Vedanta. Using the two as a reference, he found that the increase in power here was far greater than he had imagined. It seemed that as long as there was no victor in this battle, the strength of both sides would continue to increase endlessly. In fact, they were not the only ones who experienced such a change. The creation chi of the great underworld patriarch and the others also experienced the same change. The increase in their power also caused the power to maintain the order of the great Tao to increase correspondingly. Zhang Yan began to ponder in his heart. His power could still be increased, and this was first permitted by the Great Path. However, this would definitely interfere with the flow of the Great Path even more. Perhaps in the end, everything would come to a halt. Therefore, he needed to complete his Tao before that happened. However, it would not take long. Even if the spirit of creation really had this thought, under the premise of losing the transformation of the Tao technique, it wouldn't be able to wait until then. At this moment, he could feel the endless reflections of living beings pouring into his Tao technique. The reason why he couldn't succeed in one go was because he was adjusting and wearing away the differences. All of these reflections were still between the possible and the impossible. At the last moment, he would turn all of these reflections into reality. After fighting with the spirit of creation for a long time, he discovered that besides maintaining the same offensive, the spirit of creation had never stopped increasing his human nature. He thought that the spirit of creation probably didn't just want to add variables to the heavenly secrets, but to find the transformation of his own Tao technique and find a way to deal with it. Now, this was the only thing he could rely on. The order of the great path set by the great underworld patriarch isolated the transformation of their Tao technique, but the evolution of the fundamental Tao technique was not included. For example, although Zhang Yan's spiritual refinement of all beings borrowed the power of the great path chessboard, it was actually based on his own fundamental Tao technique. However, the spirit of creation's Tao technique was innate. What was so profound about it, and how exactly did it change? Even he himself couldn't figure it out. This was like how ordinary people knew that drinking water and eating could prolong their life, but they might not know how their organs worked. The boundless Tao transformation that the spirit of creation used earlier was like this, and even he himself didn't know that this Tao technique was enveloping him. Everything he did was completely based on his instincts, and he obeyed the principles of the heavenly secrets. He wouldn't take the initiative to investigate the profundities within it, because so long as he devoured all the virtue, he would naturally be able to grasp the Grand Tao. At that time, he would be able to complete himself and comprehend everything. However, if the spirit of creation truly became a living being or even a person that possessed human nature, then perhaps he would be able to find his own fundamental Tao technique, and he would be able to carry out a transformation from this. In that way, he might be able to avoid this calamity. Zhang Yan knew that because of the existence of that trace of the heavenly secrets, nothing was absolutely certain. However, he was sure that it was impossible for the spiritual refinement of all beings to be blocked head-on, because this move could be said to have gone far and descended into the mortal world. and it could be said to have perfectly unified the energy of the heavenly secrets. Beneath the Grand Tao, there was no energy that could surpass this Tao technique. Although from a certain point of view, the spirit of creation was also lowering himself to search for a way out of the heavenly secrets. This could be considered a correct choice, but it was far too late. Moreover, the most crucial thing was that he was only one person in the end. The spirit of creation didn't seem to realize this. As the intense battle between the two continued, the changes on his body became faster and faster. Blurry facial features appeared within the light, and he looked more and more like a person. At this moment, very suddenly, a ray of starlight appeared from nothingness and shone upon the spirit of creation's Wei. There was also a strand of sword will that borrowed the light to slash the spirit of creation's body. The spirit of creation's power was currently completely restrained by Zhang Yan, and he was completely powerless against this attack. When he was slashed by the sword, his original transformation was forcefully interrupted. This was a method left behind by the two patriarchs, Hongho and Yao Han. The art of spiritual enhancement for all beings had undoubtedly shouldered all the wishes of great virtue, and the two patriarchs were no exception. However, the spirit of creation's fundamental Tao technique had more than just one type of transformation, so they were worried that there would be obstacles when the time came. In order to deal with this situation, when the two of them took the initiative to enter the spirit of creation's Wei, they had placed this move within their remaining Wei to obstruct others at the critical moment. Although the two patriarchs didn't explicitly mention this to Zhang Yan, he had also sensed it. However, he didn't look deeper into it. This was because he knew that the two patriarchs didn't tell him because they wanted to prevent the spirit of creation from noticing their thoughts. As such, he had deliberately ignored it. This attack had prevented any possible variables from appearing on the spirit of creation's body, and it had also announced the end of this battle ahead of time. Zhang Yan took advantage of the moment when the spirit of creation was slightly sluggish to press forward with all his strength and force it back. Then, he took advantage of the gap to activate his Tao technique. In an instant he felt his aura fill up, and his eyes couldn't help but flash. The spirit of creation had clearly sensed the impending danger. With a bang, an unprecedented Wei suddenly erupted, and the circulation of the great Tao also slowed down a bit. Zhang Yan smiled faintly. In his divine will, countless reflections appeared, and they were supported by his fundamental Tao technique. He stretched out his hand, and with a light flick, everything became real. At the same time, he pushed outwards with his will. In an instant, a sword light that pierced through all things shot out from between his brows. This simple sword carried the Wei of the great virtue of creation. It first pushed the originally sluggish circulation of the great Tao forward again, and then it pierced through the spirit of creation's body. At this moment, the spirit of creation had completely turned into the appearance of a young Taoist. He stood there motionlessly, and after a long time, he sighed and asked, "What is this technique?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "The power of one person can't stand alone, the power of 10,000 people can move the river, and the power of 10,000 people can change the world. If the power of all living beings can be gathered, they will dare to go against the will of the heavens. This is the technique of all living beings, the Tao of all living beings." The spirit of creation didn't say anything else. The light on his body quickly dimmed, and the brilliance that covered everything also converged and dissipated. The immeasurable Wei on his body went from broad to small, continuously shrinking, and finally falling into absolute silence. Zhang Yan gazed at the place where the spirit of creation had vanished, and the solemnity in his expression didn't fade. He was certain that this time, he had truly driven this great enemy into eternal silence. However, all of this didn't seem to end just because he hadn't completed the technique, and the brand that the spirit of creation had left in the river of the great Tao didn't disappear because of this. At this moment, he sensed that a darkness that could drown everything was attacking him. At practically the same time he sensed this scene, he understood everything. He said in his heart, "So that's how it is." It turned out that the fundamental technique of the spirit of creation could only be drawn out when the spirit of creation had truly fallen into silence. This technique could be said to be the Tao of creation and destruction, the Tao of being and non-being. It was like inhaling and exhaling, one yin and one yang, one positive and one negative, and it was the simplest variation of the technique. It was precisely because of this that once the spirit of creation perished, this technique would be difficult to contain, and this was the result that would definitely be brought about after this incident occurred. The power that was about to arrive could be said to be infinitely close to the power of the great Tao, and it could devour all existences and even everything. It would be difficult for anyone to resist. At that time, everyone would be merged into it, and everything would return to one, leaving only one spirit to exist. This was because only then could the Tao be complete. Logically speaking, under that sliver of heavenly secrets, because everyone was participating in this battle of Tao, everyone had the chance to leave only one spirit to exist and become the person who obtained the Tao. But in reality, the Vedanta who put in the most effort in the battle of Tao had a higher chance of achieving the Tao. It could be Zhang Yan, the great underworld patriarch, Hong He, the great ancestor Yao Han, or even other Vedanta. Zhang Yan's gaze became extremely deep. He believed that because all of this was driven by the fundamental technique of the spirit of creation, in the end, the person who had the highest chance of obtaining the Tao might still be this person. If that was really the case, this person might come back to life again, and all the efforts he and the other Vedanta had made would be for naught. This change was something that no one could predict, and at this stage, even he could not change it. Because they had already tacitly agreed to seek the Tao, there was no way to stop all of this from happening. However, he would definitely not leave this matter to the heavenly secrets. He was very clear that as long as he could avoid this change and maintain his own existence, he would be able to obtain the Tao. Now, there was only one place he could hide. His gaze turned and looked at a boundary that was in between existence and non-existence. The 9 continents. Chapter 2350. On the chessboard of the Great Way, the battle between the Vedanta and the spirit of creation caused the worlds and even the essence of creation to merge. However, this did not include the 9 continents. That was because it was an extremely special place. Zhang Yan's understanding of this place was constantly changing. When he was in the pure yang state, he thought that this might be an existence different from the other worlds. However, it was not strange because there were too many such worlds in the universe. After attaining the spirit refinement state, he had already transcended the present world. When he looked at it again at that time, he had a different feeling. He even privately wondered if this was the chaos heaven that the patriarchs had worked together to create. After attaining the Vedanta, he was able to observe some of the mysteries of this place. However, because he felt that the opportunity was not there, he did not go there. It was not until he sat on the chessboard of the Great Way and fought with the spirit of creation that he truly recognized the essence of this place. The 9 continents were the imperfection of everything, the imperfection of all things, the imperfection of the Great Way. What was imperfection? Imperfection was change. Only with the existence of such imperfection could the Great Way be changed and change. It was precisely because of the existence of the imperfection of the Great Way that cultivators were forced to constantly pursue perfection and the higher realm. Without such imperfection, there would be no change, and the path of Tao would reach its end. Of course, it was important to understand that the 9 continents and the 9 continents were different. The 9 continents were the imperfection of the Great Way. The 9 continents and the 9 continents just happened to fall on the imperfection of the Great Way. Therefore, even without the 9 continents and the 9 continents, the imperfection of the Great Way still existed. The Tao technique of the spirit of creation could encompass everything. Even he could not fight it head-on, because this was the power of the Great Way. But at the same time, this technique was unable to conceal the flaw in the Grand Tao. Because this flaw was the foundation that this Tao art could be activated at, and only with the existence of this flaw would this technique have room to change. If it didn't exist, then this Tao art wouldn't be able to change from the beginning, and concealing this flaw was equivalent to concealing the technique itself. Back then, when the essence of creation was broken and the spirit of creation manifested, the great virtuous ones with profound cultivation, such as Tai Ming, Hong He, Yao Han, and Ling Yu, as well as Yi Chong and the Lord of the Prison Realm, all sent a clone over due to the uniqueness of the 9 continents. They also passed on their Taoist arts to this place to ensure the continuation of the human Tao. However, this was an incomplete land. Any Whaley who came here would be incomplete. In fact, they would be worn down along the way, so much so that they would constantly be pushed back. Even if the Vedanta could maintain the Whaley that they had sent here at a higher level, if they did not comply with the changes, they would never be able to enter this realm. Thus, they could only choose to lower the level of their avatars. However, even though the great benefactors had made all sorts of compromises, the troubles they suffered in the end were not limited to this. When their Whaley went to the 9 continents, they couldn't immediately reach this place as they had thought. Instead, they lingered in the absence of changes for a long time before finally settling down. This was also why when Zhang Yan later entered the Tao, the inheritance of the 4 great sects was only 10,000 years old. The Xian stone that was also left behind by the great underworld ancestral master in the Yuhuan heavens had experienced millions of years without an owner. However, the great underworld ancestral master's cultivation was very high. He could roughly calculate that if an outstanding talent appeared in the Tao of the 9 continents, the opportunity would be within 1,000,000 years. After this time limit, there was no need to wait anymore. Thus, if no one went to take it for 1,000,000 years, it would be left to the lineage of the guardian to deal with. In addition, the chaos heavens that the ancestral masters had opened in the Bu Su heaven were even more ancient. As early as the Bu Su heaven was formed, it had already fallen here. Zhang Yan had once speculated that perhaps these chaos heavens were where the ancestral masters had originally achieved their Tao. Later on, they moved to the Bu Su heaven, and just now they were residing in it. Because the Tao of the 9 continents was lacking, it shouldn't have been easy to see. Perhaps it was because of the shattering of the essence of creation that the ancestral masters sensed it and used it as their last resort. As it turned out, the power of the spirit of creation indeed couldn't penetrate this place. Perhaps it was because of the appearance of the tribulation power and the entanglement of the Vedanta, causing the ancestral masters to have no time to care about these things. Or perhaps it was because the ancestral master was high up, so he didn't look down. But at this moment, it was very likely that for the spirit of creation, the 9 continents simply didn't exist in his human Tao, so he instinctively ignored this place. When he thought up to here, he sensed something. After a short while, he sensed an indistinct pulling force. This was because he had once left behind a legacy here, and that was why he was able to sense it. Otherwise, he would have to find a way to find it himself. After taking a look, with a single thought, he turned into an avatar and sank into it. With his current Vedanta body, it was impossible for him to enter this place because his power was too strong. The 9 continents existed between existence and non-existence. If he forced his way here, then this place would never exist for him. Only by weakening his power to the same level as the ancestral masters when they first entered the 9 continents, could he see the true side of this place. After his avatar Whaley went through layers of weakening, he finally saw the 9 continents appear. But just as he was about to enter this place, he suddenly felt that there were many changes here. It was as if he was about to reach the end of the 9 continents, or even the beginning of the 9 continents. Originally, it didn't matter, but he felt that the living beings here were almost isolated from the outside world. His return this time should also give them a Tao opportunity. Hence, he calculated for a while and found a place where the various sects broke through the world and ascended. Only then did he step in. In the blink of an eye, his avatar had landed on a vast and distant land. Back then, after the tribulation of human, the southern cliff, the northern underworld, and the other continents were all destroyed. Only the Donghua continent remained intact. Because the Xian technique competition did not affect this place, all living beings survived. Hence, even though there was no trace of spiritual vigor on this continent, it still exuded a vibrant vitality. He glanced at it and felt slightly emotional. The avatar that he left here had long dissipated. Although the Tao technique that he passed down didn't need external objects, it could only be deduced to the opening of meridians and breaking through because of the limitations of his own cultivation method. Compared to the Tao technique that he later taught, It could be said to be a far cry. However, there was another reason. The 9 continents were completely created by itself, and it just happened to be located within the Great Tao. It had nothing to do with the heavens outside the world. The living beings here were not of the same origin as the spirit of creation after it was shattered, so it was extremely difficult to find a way to go to the upper realm. But now that he had returned here, he wouldn't favor one and discriminate against the other. Naturally, he should also pass down the Tao technique, so that the living beings here also had a Tao path to the Great Tao. He waved his sleeve, and countless starlight fell from the sky, turning into countless Tao inheritance stone tablets that sprinkled down towards the 9 continents. After doing this, he pondered again. Arriving here was merely the first step, and what he needed to do next was even more crucial. Earlier, he'd made a deduction in his divine decree. Based on the final outcome, even if it was only a clone, so long as it was able to successfully avoid the devouring of the Tao technique, then it would be able to leave a soul behind. But he felt that this matter involved the great Tao flaw, and there were extremely many variables. Logically speaking, various obstructions should appear in the end, or it would be simply indistinguishable, yet the outcome he obtained was so in line with his wishes. This was extremely problematic. On the other hand, since there was a problem, then if it was only a clone that descended here, then it would be unable to grasp the Grand Tao in the end? After he pondered deeply, he felt that it was very likely that after he hid in the great Tao flaw, it was equivalent to admitting that he belonged to the side of the flaw. In other words, he'd voluntarily given up on participating in the Grand Tao merging into one, thus losing the opportunity to grasp the Grand Tao. Actually, even if his clone descended into the 9 continents and was really able to avoid this change in the Tao technique, he would still be unable to accept it. The cultivation that he'd painstakingly and diligently obtained was the foundation of his existence, so how could he easily abandon it? Therefore, he had to find a way to allow his original body to similarly avoid the Tao technique of the spirit of creation. Before he came here, he had an idea. If he found another Tao technique in the 9 continents, and this Tao technique was not inferior to the Tao of strength that he found before, then it would be equivalent to him participating in the situation of the Grand Tao merging into one again. That way, he would not be excluded. Then were there other Tao techniques in existence now? The answer was yes. The path to Tao was divided into Qi, strength, and Tao. Qi was the first path of the human Tao, and all the virtuous ones had cultivated their Tao through Qi. As for the Tao of strength, from what he saw now, it was very likely that it was the path of Tao that was dominated by the variant ones. However, just like how Qi could be cultivated by demons and variant ones, the living beings of the human Tao could also walk the path of strength, so there was no clear boundary between the two. As for the remaining Tao of strength, it was the most unique Tao technique. This Tao was based on the existence of that thread of fate. Logically speaking, if a living being could comprehend the profundities of the Grand Tao, then there was no need to cultivate or use any external objects, and they could instantly ascend to the peak of the Tao technique. In reality, no one had ever done this before the spirit of creation was shattered, and there was no one after the spirit of creation was shattered. However, purely logically speaking, this possibility existed. Zhang Yan had once made some calculations about this. He found that almost all the heavenly secrets and fate were occupied by the Tao of Qi and strength, and the gap that could allow the Tao to move was already extremely limited. In other words, under normal circumstances, no one could pass through this Tao. Therefore, he came to the conclusion that unless one day the Tao of Qi and strength disappeared at the same time, or were simply shaken by some power, then the heavenly secrets that were occupied by these two Taos would be released. If there happened to be someone who could comprehend the miraculous fruit of the Grand Tao at this moment, then they could advance and achieve this Tao. And at a time like this, wasn't this the time when the Tao of Qi and strength could be activated? Before long, all things would return to normal, and the rules of the Grand Tao would be swallowed by the Tao technique of the spirit of creation. Under this result of mixing everything together, whether it was the Qi Tao or the Strength Tao, they would no longer exist, and the originally tight and orderly boundaries would also be completely broken. At that time, it would be time to seize the opportunity to seize the Tao of strength. Genius 1 second. Remember this site address. Mobile version. Chapter 2351. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment. By seizing the Dharma Tao, he would be able to merge with the Great Tao within the Great Tao imperfection. However, this still involved the problem of how to avoid being devoured by the spirit of creation's Dharma Tao. If he didn't pay attention to it, he would be able to retain a part of his spirit with his Dharmic Tao body and grasp the Great Tao. However, if he lost both his Qi and strength body, it would be equivalent to giving up on the things that he held onto. Moreover, he felt that his persistence was not useless. Even if everyone could reach the peak of the Great Path, because everyone was fundamentally different, there would definitely be differences. The first solution he thought of was still the Dharma Tao. That all beings' refinement from before was a variation of his fundamental Qi Tao. As for the Tao of strength, there were no changes. The fundamental Tao was the purest form of strength under the Great Tao. As long as it was strong enough, it could destroy all changes. However, it was obviously unwise to use this to fight against the Tao of the spirit of creation, because the Tao of creation borrowed the power of the Great Tao, and it was the wish of all the great virtue and the spirit of creation, including himself. It was impossible to fight against it. After he took control of the Dharma Tao, there was also a fundamental Tao. Although this Tao had not returned to his body, after some calculations, he believed that the changes in this Tao would turn the impossible into the possible. Of course, this also had its limits. After all, this Tao was at most equivalent to the Tao of strength. There was no way to make the power of the Great Tao retreat, but it could allow the original body to see the truth of the 9 continents and then enter it to avoid it. However, there was still a contradiction here. The Tao of law must be seized before the original body is swallowed up. Only then can the fundamental Tao change and the original body be preserved. But on the other hand, if the original body did not go and was not in the Great Tao deficiency, it meant that there were still 2 paths of Qi and strength in the world. The secrets of heaven that were occupied by these 2 paths would not be completely released, and the path of Dharma would not be favored by the original secrets of heaven. In this way, it would be difficult for him to find it. Fortunately, he had another option. In addition to the lack of the Great Tao of the 9 regions, there was another thing that could not be erased. Broken jade. This item was obtained after he entered the world, but even after he achieved great virtue, it was still difficult for him to see through its profundities. With his current knowledge, this item could even be used to deduce the Great Tao. What exactly was this thing? Before the spirit of creation was driven into silence and the Tao of creation was about to devour everything, he just now understood. If the 9 continents were said to be the lack of all things, the lack of the Great Tao, then the jade remnant was the lack of the lack. Perhaps it could be said that it was lack itself. Because lack was change, this could also be considered change itself. In the beginning, he hadn't achieved great success in his cultivation. He had once thought that if he were to accidentally lose and die, then this item might be taken by someone else to use. But as he cultivated, he gradually realized that he was the only one who could see and touch this thing. As for whether it was because the original body obtained this item that caused him to come to this world, or because his arrival caused this item to transform into flaw, or perhaps it was a combination of both, even with his current realm, it was difficult for him to determine. Just now, in the boundless Tao of the spirit of creation, he had seen some battles where the side of great virtue was defeated, but after they were defeated, there was no jade remnant left. However, he clearly knew that in those battles, there was definitely a jade remnant on his body. Perhaps it would only be there if he didn't look at it. Therefore, this remnant jade could no longer be judged by whether it existed or not. Perhaps it would be closer to its essence to use the phrase, non-existent in existence, non-existent in nothingness. Every time he sank his mind into it to calculate, it was actually a deduction of the changes. And this time, he was prepared to use this item to avoid the Tao of creation. The vision of spirit refinement was reality. Even if he only evolved a body from the jade remnant, it was undoubtedly reality. It was just that under normal circumstances, because the real body outside occupied the real side, the body inside the jade remnant could not come out. In fact, even if the real body outside was swallowed by the Tao of the spirit of creation, because the real body could no longer look at this avatar, the body could only turn back into a shadow that only existed in the jade remnant. Fortunately, he still had an avatar that existed above the 9 continents. When this avatar grasped the Tao and also possessed the ability of great virtue, he could watch this avatar turn into reality and then imprint it back into his own body to return to his original self. In this way, even if he really had to enter the great Tao because it was difficult to find the Tao, he could still use this method to find the real body. However, if he could not use any means to protect the real body, there was no need to undergo such a change. This would depend on whether the search for the Tao was successful or not. After sorting out his thoughts, he sat down cross-legged and waited for the changes in the heavenly secrets. In the silence, Zhang Yan's real body was silently observing the great Tao. Suddenly, the boundless darkness that he had sensed before suddenly appeared in the all-existence. His eyes flickered slightly, and he understood that the Tao of the spirit of creation had finally begun to activate. He could clearly feel that the Weili left behind by the great virtues in the all-existence was first swallowed by this darkness, followed by the only remaining Bushtian in the all-existence. At this time, the shadow of the great underworld patriarch suddenly appeared in his divine will. The patriarch nodded at him, and then his figure dissipated, and the Qi of creation took the initiative to go toward the Tao. Zhang Yan raised his sleeves, stood up and solemnly bowed, watching the patriarch leave. The Tao of chaos was the whole Tao and everything was in it. Except for the lack of the great Tao, there was no way to avoid it, and everything would fall into the Tao of chaos. In this, everything would turn from disorder to order, and finally, a god would appear, and this god would be able to control the great Tao. If he wanted to, he could return everything. However, he would never give this position to others, because the others might not be able to compete with the spirit of creation. Moreover, he was entrusted by the great virtues, so he had to do this. On the 9 continents, Zhang Yan's incarnation gradually dissipated and finally returned to the appearance before he entered the Tao. It seemed that he had become a mortal again. This was to be able to peep into the heavenly secrets as a mortal and comprehend the great Tao. However, in reality, it didn't matter if his avatar was a mortal or an upper realm cultivator. As long as it hadn't transcended, then it would be very different from the Grand Tao. There was no fundamental difference. However, he had a feeling that doing this was more in line with the Grand Tao. However, there was nothing to be regretful about. The Tao of Tao could be said to be completely unrelated to the Tao of Qi and power. It was a completely different path, so what he knew and saw was not the slightest help in finding the Tao of Tao. At the same time, he was also looking at the great Tao. The two were one, but they were also not. Intentionally or unintentionally, they united the high and low. The boundless darkness in the silence expanded and engulfed most things. Due to his profound cultivation, Zhang Yan's original body was still standing there without being shaken. However, it was just as he had expected. Because his main body still existed, the order of the Grand Taos in the paths of Qi and strength still persisted and didn't enter the state of the Grand Tao. As a result, most of the secrets of the heavens were still firmly controlled by these two paths. Under such circumstances, his clone was unable to pry into the door of the Grand Tao. Since that was the case, he did not hesitate too much. With a turn of his mind, he sank into the remnant jade. And outside, without him resisting, the darkness surged up and drowned his original body. At this moment, all the rules of the Great Tao collapsed, and the upper and lower boundaries no longer existed. The profoundness of the Great Tao appeared in a clear state that had never been seen before. Zhang Yan's incarnation looked up, and endless light bloomed in his eyes. He smiled and stretched out his hand, pushing open an invisible door. Then, with a step, he entered the long river of the Great Tao. And when he reached this place, his mortal body would immediately be obliterated by the operation of the Great Tao. However, when the Tao of Tao was formed, there would not be any process of accumulation in the middle, and he could directly reach the level of mastering the Tao in one step. Therefore, the moment he stepped here, he was recognized by the Great Tao itself. He walked along the riverside and walked towards the end of the Great Tao. Along the way, he could see that the Tao imprints that originally belonged to the great virtue in the long river began to disappear one by one. This was because the rules of the Great Tao had fallen into chaos, and the various Tao techniques were merging into one. As he moved forward without stopping, he also saw the imprints of the fundamental Tao techniques of the spirit of creation. However, these imprints also began to weaken, and when they completely disappeared, it would be time for the one God to appear. He could only participate in this Tao luck if he transferred his own Tao technique imprints into the river before that happened. He retracted his gaze and continued forward. When he walked to a certain place, he suddenly felt a sense of restriction, and he knew that his Tao technique should land here. Without hesitation, he immediately walked into the long river of the Great Tao and placed his imprints here. And at this step, it was time to turn back. However, now that he had lost his body of strength, there was no creation Pauline, and he had lost the foundation of the world. If another great virtue was here, it would be difficult for him to return so easily. Fortunately, at this moment, he had obtained the entire Tao of Tao. The fundamental change of the Tao of Tao was to make the impossible possible. Back then, when he obtained the entire body of strength, he could break the long river of the Great Tao with his own strength. Now, it would not be difficult for him to walk out from here with this. In fact, this was also allowed by the Great Tao. If it was not so, those who climbed the Tao of Tao would never be able to return to the all things, and it would be impossible for them to obtain the Tao techniques. However, now that all things were immersed in the Great Tao, he would not go back there. With a slight identification, he found the Tao that was previously left on the 9 continents. Then, with just a step, he walked out of the long river of the Great Tao and returned to the 9 continents. Then, he lifted his sleeve and took out the remnant of the jade. Please remember the domain name of this book, mobile version. Chapter 2352. Zhang Yan glanced at the remnant of the jade in his palm and rubbed it with his fingers. He focused his mind and sank into it. He immediately found the image of the real body that was reflected here earlier. As a Vedanta, he could naturally turn the image into reality the moment he saw it. Now that there were no chi and strength bodies outside the remnant of the jade, the body in the remnant of the jade could turn into the real one. However, the 9 continents he was in were lacking in the Great Tao. Other than him who had directly achieved Vedanta in this world, he wouldn't accept too much external power. Even if he turned his body out, the 9 continents would probably become fake in front of him, and he would fall back into the Great Tao. Fortunately, the fundamental Tao of the Tao of Law was to turn the impossible into the possible. Thus, he focused his mind and circulated the fundamental Tao. The chi and strength bodies were reflected by him and returned to his avatar. At this moment, he could be said to have chi, strength, and law at the same time. These 3 could be combined into one, and they could also be used separately. However, what was important to note here was that under the situation where there were no other chi path cultivators, he was the only one who grasped the chi path Taoist technique under the current Grand Tao. There was no one to compete with him for this Tao. In other words, just like the strength path and law path, the entire chi path was under his control. He could feel that his power had never been so strong before. He calculated with his heart. Even if the spirit of creation appeared in front of him now, with his current power, he was confident that he could drive it into absolute silence. Because he was extremely close to the Great Tao, he could see some things more clearly. The fundamental Tao that the spirit of creation grasped was different from the Vedanta. It was actually not the Tao of Qi, but the Tao of the Great Tao. Qi, strength, and law were only Taos that human Tao cultivators or living beings would separate when they cultivated. In essence, they could also be considered the Tao of the Great Tao. However, if one walked further up, in the end, they would use one Tao to combine all Taos, and use one Tao to pry into the Great Tao. Because the spirit of creation was formed from the essence of creation, it naturally occupied many Taos, and the Vedanta could not resist it. And now, the Tao that he occupied was undoubtedly more than the spirit of creation, so in terms of power, he was naturally stronger than the Vedanta. At this moment, he looked out of the 9 continents. After having a further understanding of the great Tao, he had a deeper understanding of the Tao that the spirit of creation pushed. He also discovered some things that he had not discovered before. After a moment of observation, a thought arose in his mind. If he did this, he would not be able to control the great Tao and merge it with himself. Then, not only would he be able to survive until the end, he would also be able to control the power of Tao. He would be able to become the true master of the Tao. He deduced in that. If he did this, he could not stop once he would be, and of Tao, he, and the Tao. Tao was. And he began, and of the Tao, and would the, and the Tao, and would Tao, would, and of the Tao. If he did this, he would not be able to stop once he started. Moreover, if he did not succeed, then he would be completely standing on the opposite side of the great Tao. In the end, he would either be drowned by this Tao, or he would be rejected by this Tao. In this way, he would lose the right to exist as a god. But these were all his previous knowledge. Now, he saw some deeper things, especially when the great Tao changed from chaos to order, but there were some things that he was temporarily uncertain about. First of all, although the beginning of the great Tao was pushed by the fundamental Tao of the spirit of creation, the final result was chosen by the Tao after the fate of the great Tao changed, and it seemed that it had nothing to do with the spirit of creation. But in the end, he had to admit that the Tao master recognized by the great Tao was actually decided by the Tao of the spirit of creation. Then, would there be any hidden dangers after the Tao master took control of the Tao? Even if the first problem did not exist, after the great Tao became one, would the sole God be allowed to control the entire power of the great Tao, or would the power of the great Tao control the God instead? In fact, he was leaning towards the latter, because if he did not do anything, then regardless of whether the person who took the position was him or someone else, all the power came from the great Tao. Thus, it was more like that person was forcefully pushed into that position. Even if he took control of the great Tao, he would be more like a puppet of the great Tao than the great Tao master. And it was very difficult to say whether the judgment he made was out of his own will or following the instructions of the great Tao. Thus, if he allowed this Tao to continue, the result might not be good. At best, he would be a person who had merged with the great Tao. At worst, he would be the Tao master on the surface, but the spirit of creation would be behind him. Or perhaps, the two of them would be inseparable. When he thought of this, he decided to act according to his own thoughts and not follow the trend. Especially now that he had the power to surpass the other party, there was even less need for him to compromise. At this moment, the only advantage the spirit of creation's great Tao had against him was that he had the upper hand, and he was able to take control of the power of the great Tao. This power could not be resisted head-on, so what he needed to do now was to continuously suppress this momentum while protecting himself, and then slowly move the power of the great Tao that was originally being used by the spirit of creation to himself. Moreover, for every bit of power that he could borrow, the momentum of the great Tao would decrease by a bit. There was no need for him to completely absorb this power, and he only had to wait until he took control of the momentum. Then he would naturally be able to fuse this Tao into himself and take everything left behind by the spirit of creation as his own. If the spirit of creation was still able to take control of this Tao, then it would obviously be impossible for him to succeed. But now, he was the only one left under the great Tao. So long as he possessed sufficient power, then no matter what he chose, no one would be able to stop him. However, to achieve this, he needed to use the fundamental Tao to pry open the power of the great Tao. Fortunately, the Tao could make the impossible possible. Even if he couldn't obtain all the power of the great Tao at once, it wasn't difficult to pry open some power of the great Tao. It was just a process of accumulation. At this moment, he looked outside the 9 continents. If all the power of the great Tao was driven by the momentum of the great Tao, then he wouldn't be able to borrow any power of the great Tao at all. So he had to act as soon as possible. Thinking of this, he didn't delay any longer. He waved his sleeve, moved his feet, and walked out of the 9 continents. When he arrived outside the great Tao, the boundless darkness once again enveloped his body. He didn't forcefully resist it, but instead walked towards the area that hadn't been devoured by the momentum of the great Tao. At the same time, he threw a punch from time to time. Just like when he fought against the spirit of creation before, this kind of collision caused the circulation of the great Tao to stagnate, but it was more violent than before. And in this gap, he would use the fundamental Tao and try to seize the power of the great Tao. Although only a little power of the great Tao would be thrown to his side every time, it was enough. As long as he still had a trace of the power of the great Tao in his hands, he would never reach the end, and the momentum of the great Tao would never be completed. As he gathered it bit by bit, the power of the great Tao that he could use also increased. And because there was no one to obstruct him at this moment, he could use this power to pry more power of the great Tao. This process was very smooth. The situation went from being weak to being evenly matched, and then it was quickly reversed. And at this step, the momentum of the great Tao had also been combined by him, and all the operations would be under his control. He unceremoniously put all his power into the law that he ruled, and his mind was also immersed in it. Then, he pushed the power of the great Tao to complete this final transformation. As his consciousness fluctuated, suddenly, there was a burst of light. He looked over and saw the great Tao galaxy appear in front of him. Even if he didn't deliberately go there, the expansion of his own power had pushed him here. He looked at the end of the great Tao river and couldn't help but sigh. After all the trials and tribulations, he was finally about to arrive. This path was much shorter than he had imagined, but it was also much longer than he had imagined. Fortunately, the person who had arrived here was still him. From beginning to end, nothing had changed. Just as he was about to take a step there, an inexplicable throbbing appeared in his heart. After a moment of thought, he revealed a thoughtful expression. Because this path was completely created by him, and not pushed by the great Tao itself, he could only choose how he wanted to go from here on out. Now, there were two paths in front of him. One was the path that he should have taken after obeying the great Tao, which was to become the master of the great Tao. But just as he had thought, he was the master in name, but in reality, he was the puppet of the great Tao. Compared to the original great virtue, other than being one level higher and being able to use the power of the great Tao, there wasn't much difference. Most importantly, he had ascended to this level, which meant that he had walked this path. Those who came after him could also achieve this. Because there was only one position, he could either desperately suppress those who came after him so that he would always be at the top, or he could give up this position and completely integrate into the great Tao. Aside from this, there was no other choice. The other path was the one that he had walked himself. The great Tao was not the great Tao. Although he was the master of the great Tao, he was just a passerby here and would eventually leave to search for the higher realm. Did the higher realm exist? He smiled faintly. The remnant of the jade was still in his sleeve. As long as it was there, it meant that there was a flaw, and that there was a change. This proved that it could still go up. The path of the great Tao was endless. If he had chosen the first path and become complacent, this thing might have left him. Moreover, since he had sworn to open a path for all living beings, he should naturally carry out this path so that those who came after him could have a path and not become the one who blocked the path. With this thought in mind, the galaxy in front of him changed slightly. He waved his sleeves and strode forward, quickly arriving at the end of the galaxy. This was the end of all things and also the end of the great Tao. He walked up without stopping, turned around, and looked at the endless galaxy of the great Tao floating in front of him. He chanted, "The heart of the mortal world is not difficult to comprehend, opening the path to heaven in the mortal world. I only hope that all living beings can live forever, and that I will be the master of the great Tao for all eternity." You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.